Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. I'm your host, Wiam Nemu, and today our guest is Professor Paul-Alain Beaulieu. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Approximately.
I tried. We are so happy to have you here today. Thank you for making the time for this interview. You have extensive research into the Babylonian, Neo-Babylonian area, the Chaldeans. So your bio, you've held positions at the Yale Babylonian Collection, Harvard, the University of Notre Dame, before joining the University of Toronto's Department of Near and Middle Eastern Studies. You earned your degrees in law and history from the Université de Montréal and PhD in Assyriology from Yale University in 1985. In 2020, Mr. Professor Beaulieu was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He has conducted research on the civilizations of ancient Iraq, concentrating mainly on the first millennium BC. He has written extensively on Babylonian history, religion, science, and linguistics. He is the author of several books, including A History of Babylon. His current projects involve researching the cuneiform archives of the Neo and Late Babylonian period from the 8th to 2nd centuries, particularly those of the cities of Ur and Uruk in southern Iraq, and the development of historical thought in ancient Mesopotamia. Wow. So I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to start with something very simple, which is, if you can share with us your background, your educational background, and what led you to particularly study this profession.
Well, I was always interested in ancient civilizations, even from my childhood. In particular, the civilizations of the Near East and Northeast Africa. So, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia. And eventually, I was interested also in history in general. And when I started studying at the University of Montreal, I started in the law school. I completed the degree, but then I realized that my main interest was really ancient history, and I couldn't repress it. So I went to the history department, did an MA in ancient history. And then eventually I went to Yale University to pursue studies specifically in the field of Assyriology, which is the discipline that studies the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Iraq, if you want to speak, in terms of modern countries. So I pursued those studies, and I stayed on at Yale for a very long time after that, after I graduated, as a lecturer and research scholar. Work in the Yale Babylonian Collection, which has the largest collection of cuneiform tablets in North America, and one of the largest in the world, in fact. And then, I continued my academic career at Harvard, and I was visiting professor also at Notre Dame. And finally, I came to Toronto in 2006, as professor of Assyriology, and I've been here since.
And so, as a Chaldean, and as the executive director of the Chaldean Cultural Center, we have a big interest in the history of this community. I've been reading your work for a while. I got your book quite recently, so I haven't been able to go through the whole thing, but it's been very fascinating. I'm trying to show it here. But the history of Babylon. And actually what I like about how you're writing, I'm able to comprehend. I like the timeline that you take us through. I find that very effective, because this is what we're trying to see, is trying to trace our roots. So I found that very effective. So let's dive into the Chaldean period that we want to learn about. So it's a remarkable dynasty of ancient Mesopotamian history, and you, being one of the major scholars in the field, have evidently encountered the Chaldeans, the ancient Chaldeans at least. Could you tell us as a specialist of this period, when the first mention of the term Chaldean was. And I know that there's a different time frame for the biblical part, and then there's a different time frame for academia and for the scholars, correct?
Yes. Well, basically, the earliest mentions of the Chaldeans that we have now, and some of this evidence has surfaced only, a few years ago, date from around 1100 BC. And the main evidence is from an inscription that was discovered in an excavation in the Middle Habur region in Syria. And it's an inscription of a local ruler, of a city called Tabeti in ancient time, and the modern site is Tel Taban. And the inscription was published a few years ago, and it's an inscription of a local Assyrian ruler called Ashur-Ketal-Lishir, who was probably more or less a vassal of the king of Assyria. And he talks about, it's a building inscription, but he mentions in his inscription that he had to lead an expedition against the Arameans and the Chaldeans who were making trouble in the area. So, and the term for Chaldean there is Chaldi, and of course it is the same word that we encounter later in reference to the Chaldeans, Chaldu or Chaldi. And the significant fact is that he mentions them together with the Arameans, which is very important. We must realize that at the same time, the Arameans were making very important incursions into Assyrian territory. And the king of Assyria, around 1100, Tiglath-Pileser I, warred against the Arameans and mentions them in his inscriptions. However, he does not mention the Chaldeans. But there's one administrative text from his reign which does allude to an expedition against the Chaldeans. So these are the two earliest mentions of the Chaldeans. And after that, we must jump to the 9th century, almost 300 years later.
Okay, and you talk quite a bit also in your books and in your papers about the Chaldean tribes.
Mm-hmm.
There was, I believe you mentioned 5 major, I forgot if it was 5 or 6 major tribes that were based in southern Mesopotamia. Could you talk more about these tribes and what you know about them?
Yeah, basically there were 5 tribes. Well, we call them tribes. We're not completely certain about the social structure of the Chaldeans, but let's call them tribes. There was the Bit Dakuri, the Bit Amukani, the Bit Yakin, the Bit Sha'ali, and the Bit Shilani. So the 3 major ones were Bit Yakin, Bit Dakuri, and Bit Amukani. And all 3 of them are mentioned together in the inscriptions of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, who reigned in the second half of the 9th century. And Shalmaneser III encountered these Chaldeans, and they seem to have been well established already in Babylonia at the time, in southern Iraq. And they had small kingdoms, that were embedded into the larger kingdom of Babylon. So these are the 5 clans, or tribes that we know about.
Thank you. And in your paper, the one that's entitled Arameans, Chaldeans, and Arabs in Cuneiform, you mentioned that in the book of Jeremiah and the book of the Kings, the second king of the Chaldean period, Nebuchadnezzar II will appear to have the title King of Babylon, yet elsewhere as King of the Chaldeans in the biblical accounts. Moreover, the term Chaldean, Kachin in Hebrew, is used in the biblical accounts to refer to both the army and the people led by Nebuchadnezzar. However, you also note that there is no evidence that Nebuchadnezzar considered himself the ruler of Chaldeans and Armenians. You note that if we scrutinize the sources more closely, some evidence begins to emerge that appears to vindicate the biblical view. Could you please expand on that regarding?
Okay, that's a very complicated question actually, because when we talk about the Chaldean period in Babylonia, or the Chaldean Empire, which is the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which ruled, from 626 until 539, and was the last Mesopotamian empire. It's been called traditionally the Chaldean Empire because, Assyriologists and historians assumed from the beginning that that dynasty was in fact Chaldean, okay, although there's no evidence for it. So, and the evidence is simply biblical, because the Bible claims that Nebuchadnezzar ruled over the Chaldeans and Arameans, was king of the Chaldeans, and came to besiege Jerusalem with Chaldeans and Arameans. Now that's the perspective from the kingdom of Judah. That's not what Nabopolassar or Nebuchadnezzar say about themselves. They never mention that they're Chaldeans or that they're descendant of Chaldeans. However, the Chaldeans and the Arameans were still, very important components of society during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And they probably furnished many contingents in the army. If not, maybe they may even have been dominant in the Neo-Babylonian army. So Nebuchadnezzar must have come to Jerusalem with troops made up largely of Chaldeans and Arameans. And this is why the Bible claims, you see, that he was their ruler. Now, the question of the origins of that dynasty is disputed. There is some claim, a little bit of evidence, that cannot be really, it's not completely convincing, it's tangential, that Nabopolassar, the founder of the empire, of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, belonged to the Bit Dakuri, one of the three most important Chaldean clans. Now, this evidence is speculative, so we're not certain about that. But Nabopolassar himself claims he was the son of a nobody, so he had no prestigious extraction. And he was only chosen by the gods, and especially by the god Marduk, to be king of Babylon and to rebel against the Assyrians and expel them from Babylonia. So, and his son Nebuchadnezzar never claimed, Chaldean descent either. But later kings, like Neriglissar and Nabonidus, do claim, do name their own father, whom they call the prestigious prince. And, one was an Aramean, Neriglissar was clearly of Aramean descent, and Nabonidus, of mixed Aramean and Assyrian descent, probably. So we don't know exactly, the origins of that dynasty. So, and it has caused many people who are not specialists to assume that the Neo-Babylonian Empire corresponded to the height of Chaldean influence. Okay, but in fact, by that time, the influence of the Chaldeans had waned considerably, in Mesopotamia. And in fact, the high point of Chaldean influence was the 8th century. So when you have, when you had Chaldean chieftains who claimed and usurped the Babylonian throne, and there were several of them. And all three main clans in succession claimed, you see, the Babylonian throne, the Bit Dakuri, the Bit Dabukani, and the Bit Yakin. And they were fierce opponents to the Assyrian attempts to take over Babylonia. But that ended in 689 with the destruction of Babylon by Sennacherib and the ousting of the last of those Chaldean rulers of Babylon.
So, based on what you're saying, this is also when it comes to the church or unification with the Roman Church, there are certain speculations on why the name Chaldean was given. But does it seem like in the Bible, is that not also evidence, or is it because if it's the Bible, you said the only evidence that we have, but is that not evidence? Would the word Chaldean just have been randomly chosen? Why would it have been chosen to describe Nebuchadnezzar? My other curious to know is, could it be because of the political situation of that region, that the role that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to play was in order to kind of maybe create some peace, or whatever the political situation was, did not want to identify as a Chaldean? Could that have been a reason? I know I read in George Smith's the Chaldean account of Genesis, a lot of the stories, the Chaldean stories and the Babylonian stories were suppressed and oftentimes erased or borrowed from the Chaldeans by the Assyrians. Sorry, the Assyrians had borrowed or suppressed or erased a lot of the Chaldean stories. So could these aspects, the political aspects, play a role in the war and everything else that was involved during that period?
Well, that's quite complicated now, because when you mention George Smith, of course, he's a 19th century author, and their use of the word Chaldean was derived from the Greek understanding of Chaldean. The problem is that, you see, after, the word Chaldean changes meaning during the Achaemenid period, and mostly in the Greek sources. So after the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, so during the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, we know that there were two Chaldean clans that still existed because they're documented. So that's the Bit Amukani and the Bit Dakuri. Okay. And we know that by that time, the Bit Yakin had disappeared, so because it was destroyed by the Assyrians in the 7th century. So these two clans are mentioned during the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar mentions them in a document which is called, his court calendar or his Hof calendar, where he names the main holders of main office holders at his court, and also the main provincial governors of Babylonia. And among these provincial governors, you have, the, leader of the Bit Dakuri and the leader of the Bit Amukani. He's called son of Dakuru and son of Amukanu. So one is called Bibea, the other one is called Bellehi. And we have texts from Uruk, from the temple archives of Uruk, dated to the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which do mention the Bit Dakuri and the Bit Amukani. So they mention the elders, you see, of those two clans. So there's very tangible evidence for them. Now, after the downfall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, mentions of these clans and of the Chaldeans disappear in cuneiform sources. So we don't know what happens to them. And our next step is, in the 5th century, we have this Greek historian called Herodotus. And Herodotus claims that the priests of the god Belos, that's the god Marduk, in Babylon, were called Chaldeans. So, but we don't know why he says that. And Herodotus never went to Babylon. And he probably had informants who went there and told him all sorts of stories. Now, why does he say that? Well, we can speculate, that by the 5th century, the Achaemenid rulers who actually suppressed 2 waves of rebellions in Babylonia against their rules, they may have installed Chaldeans as priests, you see, of the god Marduk in Babylon. But what I'm saying, when I'm saying this, it's entirely speculative. Maybe Herodotus just did not understand, you see, what was happening, you see, in Babylon. So we don't know, but there's a shift of meaning. You see, Chaldean referred for centuries to very specific peoples who had settled in Babylonia. They're no longer mentioned after the 6th century. And in the 5th century, the word Chaldean has a new meaning. So these are priests of the god Marduk. And after that, in Greek sources, which are the only sources that mention Chaldeans, the word Chaldean has two meanings. One is, again, a priest or a Babylonian priest or a soothsayer, an astrologer or a diviner. And the other meaning is simply, Chaldea is a synonym for Babylonia, and Chaldean is a synonym for Babylonia. So you have these two meanings in the Greek sources. But how that relates to the real Chaldeans, we don't know.
And so there's a mention also that according to the inscription of Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned between 745 and 727 BC, he boasts of having deported hundreds of thousands of Chaldeans from Babylonia. Is there any mention of where he might have settled them? And given that he's claiming hundreds of thousands, and it's said that they don't really know, where would they have relocated to? I mean, like, how far could they have gone? And that's another reason why I'm wondering, why is it kind of seems difficult to think that the Chaldeans continued? If there was hundreds of thousands of Chaldeans that were deported, where would they have gone, without planes taking them thousands and thousands of miles away? Wouldn't they have just kind of relocated in a nearby area? And maybe perhaps because of the political persecution, because of their situation, just kind of kept low just to survive, perhaps?
Yeah, though, of course, Tiglath-Pileser III was the builder of the centralized Assyrian Empire. And he instituted a systematic policy of deportations everywhere. So every area that he conquered, he deported people. And he did that in Babylonia as well, because he claimed the title of King of Babylon, and actually fought against the Chaldean rulers there. So his inscriptions talk about all 5 Chaldean clans and how he interacted with them. And he claims to have destroyed both the Bit Shilani and the Bit Sha'ali, who were the 2 less important ones, and actually disappear after his reign. So only the 3 big ones are left. And he also claims to have warred against the Bik Amukani and to have destroyed it as well. And altogether, he mentions optimally, I think it's 150,000 Chaldeans that he deported from Babylonia. Now, he doesn't always mention where he deported them, but in a couple of inscriptions, he says that he deported them to Assyria. Okay. But he doesn't mention any specific place in Assyria. So he just mentions that he deported them to Assyria. Of course, Assyria was a large territory by then, and that could mean in the heartland of Assyria, in northern Iraq. It could be also in the Habur region. It could be along the Euphrates in Syria. We don't know exactly, but he did deport them to Assyria. So it's likely that, from what we know of the, Assyrian imperial practices, they would use deportees to resettle areas that had been depopulated, or they would send them to their capital cities that they were building at the time. So, and one very important capital city that Tiglath-Pileser III inherited from his predecessors is Kalhu, modern Nimrud, you see, in northern Iraq. And Tiglath-Pileser III even built an additional palace there for himself. So he may have deported part of these Chaldeans to Nimrud, you see, to his capital, basically as workers, you see, or to settle these large royal residences, you see, that they were building. But we don't have any specific information. It just says to Assyria. But he did deport, large numbers of Chaldeans, according to what he says. Of course, we have to add some, to believe at least the basics of these inscriptions. The numbers may not be as large as he claims, but it involves tens of thousands.
Yeah, and they always say the victors write the history. So I mean, I'm just, from what I've been reading over time, it just seems that there could have been, where the Chaldeans, because it seems like their existence, there was like spotted here and there, and then by him saying, even if there were only 50,000 that were deported, but there seems to have been that, to me, that seems like evidence that they continued. And then there was other, also from my understanding, is because for religious purposes, as they embraced Christianity in that region, for various reasons, because of what the Chaldeans believed in, or the fact that they were considered magicians and pagans. So religiously, the Christianity wanted to distance themselves from them. Others found them, because of they were given the terms of astrologers and magicians, and then rather than looking, some might say that they were so sophisticated in that fashion, but religiously that had a negative connotation, and some considered them demonic because of it. So there was this contradictions of them, seeing them as such sophisticated people who were able to create so many things during the ancient times. And then over time, it seems like for religious purposes, political purposes, they had to kind of, many had to distance themselves. And then there was a lot of destruction of trying to erase their names. I mean, that's just, kind of my observation. But I have so many other questions, and I know I was already telling you that I'm going to end up keeping you later than I had promised.
Just if I can jump in, you see
Yes, of course.
the term Chaldean in history has had three main meanings. The Chaldean people who invaded and set Babylonia and settled there in the Iron Age, so in the early first millennium BC. The second meaning, which may not be connected to the first one, is an astrologer or priest from Babylonia, and that meaning stayed on until the first and second century of our era. And the third meaning was adopted by Christians in Iraq, so who started claiming the ethnonym Chaldean, for their church and the Christian people of Iraq. Now, I don't know exactly when is the earliest attestation of the term Chaldean to designate Christian, but again, it may not be related directly to the second or first meaning of Chaldean, because it's not because it's the same word that there's necessarily a direct genealogy between the three uses of the term. So even if many modern Iraqi Chaldean Christians are probably descendants of the ancient people of Iraq, who they've always lived there. But it's very difficult to follow the genealogy of these meanings.
So a major historian who claims to be Chaldean and who wrote in Greek in the 4th century BC, Berosus, is a stand advocate for setting the record straight on Babylonian history. His account on the Hanging Gardens and Nebuchadnezzar's building projects have been treated. I'm sorry, I'm not sure but could you tell us about Berosus and his work and what you know about him?
Okay, so Berosus was Berosus is known mainly from his own work, which was called the Babyloniaca, which was a history of Babylonian culture, written in Greek for the rulers of the Seleucid Empire. So he lived in the 3rd century BC, and by that time, the Near East was ruled by a Greek Macedonian dynasty. You see, that succeeded, claimed part of the empire of Alexander the Great. So the Seleucids ruled, Syria and Mesopotamia in the 3rd century. And Berosus allegedly wrote this book and dedicated it to the second Seleucid ruler, Antiochus I, who started to rule in 281 BC. Now, Berosus claimed that he was a priest of the god Bel in Babylon. so of the god Marduk, the main god of Babylon. And there's no reason to doubt that. His work has not survived in its entirety. It has survived in what we call fragments, in that quotations of his works by other authors, mainly church fathers. And also there's a substantial excerpt in the works of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century AD. So his work has been, scrutinized and analyzed, by many scholars, including myself. And in some respect, he's very well informed. So he gives us information which is corroborated by cuneiform documents from that period. But sometimes he goes on a tangent, you see, and the information seems fantastical and garbled. So he makes all sorts of claims. Now, he uses the term Chaldean and Chaldea to refer to Babylonians and Babylonia. But by doing so, don't forget he writes in Greek, and he adopts the Greek point of view sometimes about Babylonia. So his use of Chaldea and Chaldean is the second usage that you see in Greek sources, which is simply a synonym for Babylonian and Babylonia. So his work, the surviving fragments go over a few pages only in a book, but they're very important. And in terms of setting the record straight, he wants basically his main point. I mean, one of his main points is that, of course, in his lifetime, the legend of Semiramis had become very dominant among the Greeks. And that legend was started by the Greek historian Ctesias, who wrote a history of Assyria and Persia around 400 BC. He lived at the Persian court. So, 150 years before Berosus. And Ctesias claims that Semiramis, was an Assyrian queen who actually founded Babylon and built, all its monuments. And of course, Berosus knew very well that this was false because, of course, he had access to all the Babylonian historical documents, that were available at the time. And he knew very well that first Babylon had not been founded by Semiramis. In fact, for him, it was an antediluvian city. So it was a city of, primeval origin. But also he knew very well that it was, the king Nebuchadnezzar who created most of the monuments that could still be seen in Babylon, and more including the Hanging Gardens, for which there's no strong evidence, but they must have existed at any rate. And so that's basically what he tried to do, you see. And it's basically to explain to the Greek rulers, the Greek Seleucid rulers, the importance of Babylon, and also to reject, Ctesias, as a source for Babylonian history. Because Ctesias was not interested in Babylon. He was interested in Assyria and Persia. You see, so he reflects the mindset of the Persians, during the time of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persians saw themselves as successors to the Assyrians. And they saw Babylon just as an episode. You see, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was just an episode in the history of the region. And in fact, you see, what mattered was Assyria, and then what mattered now was Persia. So of course, Berosus could not, vindicate that. He was against that idea.
So regarding so at the dawn of the Christian period, say roughly the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD, what groups might we assume settled across Mesopotamia?
Well, that's a very difficult question because we have very few sources. During that period, from 100 BC until 250 AD, Mesopotamia was ruled by the Parthians. Basically a Persian dynasty that was very Hellenized, but that partly probably claimed the heritage of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. So it's a new Persian empire that will be succeeded eventually by the Sasanians in the 3rd century. Now, we don't have that many sources for the Parthians, but from the 1st century of Parthian rule, we have some cuneiform sources from Babylon still. And those sources clearly show that there's at least one group that tried to invade and settle Mesopotamia, and these were Arabs. So there were very important Arab tribes, along the Euphrates, south of the Euphrates, on the fringe of the Arabian desert. And they will be there until the beginning of Islam, basically. So Arabs were very close to the settled areas of Iraq. And we have texts from Babylon that mention, their repeated incursions into Babylonia. So the Arabs may have settled there, in groups already, and even before that, because Arabs are mentioned already in the 9th century BC in Assyrian inscriptions. So this is one group that certainly we know settled in Babylonia at the time, even if it was not in very large numbers. But for the ethnic composition of Babylonia at the time, I mean, it was a mixture, already in the Achaemenid period. It's a mixture of all sorts of people, so you had the native population, you had the Chaldeans, the Arameans that came earlier, and then many people were deported to Babylonia by, kings like Nebuchadnezzar during the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire.
Like the Jewish, there was a lot of the Jewish community.
Yes, like the Judean, the people from the kingdom of Judah were deported there, and most of them probably stayed there, did not return to Jerusalem once they were allowed to return by the Achaemenid kings. And then, but you had many other people, during the Achaemenid period that were brought them as, mercenaries, soldiers, settlers, for all sorts of reasons. So it was a mixture of people. There were Iranians, obviously, who settled, in Babylonia and stayed there. And during the Seleucid period, after Alexander the Great, well, there were many Greeks, who settled there. And so it became a very cosmopolitan place. So, and we don't have enough documents to say, well, you had that many people from that group and that many from the other group. It just became a mixture. But the bulk of the population was probably the population that had been there before.
So, a lot of Chaldeans, what we wonder is that why have the modern Chaldeans not, or have they? I know they've been a topic of research for just very, very few professors here in Michigan, but more recently I've been contacted by other universities as they do interviews and as students write about the Chaldeans. But why aren't they studied? And also, what is the root of Assyriology versus, like, why isn't there a Chaldeanology that's being studied, given that the history does actually go back quite a bit? I mean, I just researched Ilyas al-Musadi, who traveled from Baghdad, a priest that traveled from Baghdad, and he was the first to reach the Americas, and he considered himself Chaldean, and he started his journey in 1682.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Maria Theresa Esmar, who considered herself a Chaldean, who wrote in the 1800s, who traveled from our ancestral village of Tepkepe and went to Europe, and she the memoirs of a Babylonian princess, and her work was actually sponsored by Queen Victoria. And then we have another a memoir which a priest, Father Joseph Naim, who endured the 1915 genocide, and he wrote about it. And he came to the United States. There's many articles about him, like from 1920 onward, where he was bringing awareness about the Chaldeans. So is there, I mean, I don't even know if you would even know the answer, but we're just curious, why hasn't this community been studied, despite the fact that they have authored and these people that wrote about their experiences were not really trying to be writers. They were just trying to document the history of the Chaldean or the people, or what was happening to them. So I'm just curious if there's, you think, a reason, or if it's just because we haven't really written enough about our back community. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, your question raises the issue of how academic disciplines are established in universities. So, the first people in Western countries who studied, the Chaldeans in Iraq, I mean, the modern Chaldeans, the Chaldean Christians, were basically, clerics from the Catholic Church, who were began to be interested in Eastern Christianity, in the Renaissance, after the Renaissance, so in the 17th, 18th century, and continued into the 19th century. Most studies of the Chaldean Church were basically oriented towards the history of Christianity, and they were mainly made by clerics who started studying those languages. They studied Syriac, and other languages used by Eastern Christians. So now you also have the issue of Chaldeans in Iraq, modern Chaldeans, who have traditions about their own history, obviously. But in terms of modern academia, the history of Near Eastern Christians is very much part of the history of the modern Middle East, or the early modern Middle East. So you don't have a specific discipline of studying, Chaldeans or Chaldeology, if you want. It's either part of the history of Near Eastern Christianity or the history of the Middle East, since, in the past few centuries. Again, the connection to ancient Chaldeans is, cannot be established because we have a broken line of transmission, basically. So, and we don't know much about the ancient Chaldeans either. We don't know their language at all. So we don't have a single sentence in ancient Chaldean. And the only guidelines we have to establish their ethnicity and language are personal names of Chaldeans. Unfortunately, most Chaldeans adopted Babylonian names. And this is the remarkable fact about ancient Chaldeans, is that they espoused the Babylonian culture. So they became completely integrated in the Babylonian culture. You see? So they became one with Babylonians, with the population.
Isn't that so? There's like some similarities from what you're describing. So, and so I have an Arabic name. I don't have a Chaldean name. So we integrated into the Arab culture, started speaking Arabic, and reading and writing Arabic, and we were discouraged from continuing, our Chaldean traditions and such. And then coming to the United States, that continued, where people started naming their children Western names, and and things like that. And I appreciate the information that you're sharing. It's really interesting because I see what you're saying about there is these gaps, but at the same time, what we're curious about, for instance, Professor Yasmin Hanoch of Portland University, she wrote a book about the Chaldeans, and in it stated about speculations why she thinks that the Pope gave the Chaldean, the people that went to the Pope to unite with the Roman Catholic Church, why he gave them the name Chaldean, which interestingly was about, like, it was prestigious, but at the same time it was prestigious on one hand, but then on the other hand it was also, the name was demonized. So I don't know, and that was speculated. But then she mentions about like the Assyrians, and the Assyrians saying that their name, they were not even called Assyrians until the late 19th century by European missionaries. If this is accurate, then again, why are the universities, why did they embrace that later name, if that is the case, and not the fact on researching the Chaldeans, who would, in this case, have a further history.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, that's
I
based on what
well,
I'm
I mean the yes, I mean the name Assyrian for Northern Iraqi Christians is a recent, development, but I mean it's probable that in Iraq, the Iraqi Christians, ever since Christianity was established in Iraq, had a memory. You see, I mean, because it was known that Assyria had been there, and in the south, it was known that this was Babylonia or Chaldea, and these were Babylonians or Chaldeans. So these names never disappeared. You see, and the so I don't know the history of the Iraqi Christians, but I mean, except in very broad outlines. But I mean, when the Pope decided to call, southern Iraqi Christians Chaldeans, um, this was probably a geographic denomination, you see, because they knew, that, in Greco-Roman sources, this area was called Chaldea. In fact, even in the 19th century, if you look at the early books on Assyriology, you see on the discoveries in Iraq, they always talk about Chaldea. They don't talk about Babylonia because they were following still the Greek, you see, the established Greek name. And then later on, Chaldea fell into disuse, and they started using Babylonia, you see, for the ancient civilization of southern Iraq. So it's simply that, it's always been known that this was Chaldea or Babylonia. And I think it's natural, it's perfectly natural, that the Pope decided, well, these Iraqi Christians, they're pre-Islamic, obviously. So the people who did not convert to Islam, so they retain Christianity and they retain traditions and, the Aramaic language, and why not call them Chaldean? Because they're probably the descendant of, the people who were there before. And who was there before? Well, they're either Babylonians or Chaldeans, and these are synonyms. So it's not very complicated.
And we have some of some of our Chaldean historians who say, historians from Iraq, who say that the bishops that approached the Pope introduced themselves as Chaldeans. So if we were to try to find a document that where this meeting took place, how would we get a hold of something like that? Like, would there be this documented somewhere that says who were the people or what was the conversation that took place with the Pope where he gave them that name? And it's also because it's people say, well, naturally he gave them the name that they introduced themselves. So it doesn't seem, like he picked it out of thin air, like just randomly, it could be because of what you just said, because of the historical geographic position, but also if the people introduce themselves as that would just kind of seem like common sense that he would just give them those titles. But I mean, I'm asking this because we're really in the process of learning about our roots. We have been on, our community has been on survival mode for a very long time, with the interest when we were in Iraq of how to leave Iraq, when, why, should we not, and then when we came here, it was on a different type of survival mode. But we're right now in a position where we're really exploring and I think having fun at figuring all these things out, and you're kind of helping us do that. It's really fun for us to read this and to feel some kind of a connection to our ancestors. And I don't think anybody here is like 100% purebred or anything like Chaldean, but there is some resemblance to the people of the ancients that we feel a connection to, and just the fact that they continued on with the name. But I want to, I know you have only a few minutes left.
Yeah, people, of course, we can be biological descendants of ancient people, but at some point the cultural connection, is broken. So, with the advent of Christianity, I mean, this was a huge break, you see, in the Near East. So Christianity created an entirely new civilization. So even, you see, I mean, I may be biological descendant of the ancient people who were in France, but I mean, the connection to those people from 2,000, 3,000 years ago is purely biological. The idea, it's not. I mean, what is left of their culture in what I do is distant. So and so with the same, when they teach, well, to take again the example of France, they used to teach in textbooks that we are descendant of the Gauls, you see, which is true, you see, because they are partly descendant of the Gauls, but they don't. Once you've said that, that's it. You see, so because so many things, so many things happen in between. Well, the modern Egyptians, they're descendant of the ancient Egyptians. Of course, other people came and settled, but the bulk of the population descends from the ancient Egyptians. But once you've said that, I mean, what of the culture of ancient Egypt is left in Egypt, which has been thoroughly Christianized and then Islamicized, is distant, So it's always the same issue when you have these kind of labels, that travel through time, but at some point, all you can say is that yes, obviously we're descendant of these ancient peoples, but I mean, how Christians in Iraq viewed the word Chaldean and Chaldea in 1500 or 1600, I don't know which documents we have that could give us all that much information about that. I mean, I'm not a specialist of those periods, but it would be nice to have something. Maybe in the archives of the Vatican there is something.
I know. I'm thinking to knock on their doors next.
Yes.
I have, and then I'll email you if I have any findings. But I'll go there. When I visited Rome, I was not interested to find. This was a long time ago. I was there for a while, and I was not interested to find out about my lineage. So, if I go back again, I'll make an attempt to find out. With the little time that we have, I want just a little bit background, if you can share with us regarding the Aramaic, the history of the Aramaic language, and just its roots. If you could just share a little bit of that.
Yeah, the Aramaic language basically emerged, in the early first millennium BC during the Iron Age in Syria. There were several principalities in Syria, several states that were, obviously settled by the Arameans, who were generally newcomers in the area. And the Aramaic language is a West Semitic language, so it's a branch of the Semitic family. So it's closer to Hebrew, Phoenician, and people, all the Levantine languages than it is to, Arabic or Akkadian or Ethiopic. So it's a branch. Most scholars suspect that Chaldeans were Aramaic speakers. You see that they were closely related to the Arameans. So when Arameans and the Chaldeans settled in Iraq, they brought their language with them. And eventually that language, Aramaic, was adopted by the Assyrian and Babylonian and Achaemenid Empire as an official language. And eventually Aramaic replaced Akkadian completely, you see, in Iraq. So Iraq, like Syria and the southern Levant, became Aramaic speaking, you see. So by the time of by the Hellenistic period, Iraq, Syria, and the southern Levant were Aramaic speaking. And the Chaldeans were probably Aramean speakers because although they were heavily assimilated into the Babylonian civilization, they probably kept their language, you see, as a spoken language. And also, in the few cases where we have a Chaldean who doesn't have a Babylonian name, that name is obviously Semitic, and it's obviously West Semitic, and it's very probably Aramean, you see. And that includes the clans, the Bit Yakin, the Bit Dakuri, and the Bit Amukani. These are probably Aramean names. They're names of ancestors, basically. So this is the the origins of the Aramaic language. Again, when we talk about Chaldeans, people that we know very little about in ancient times, except for their political impact on Babylonia. We don't know their religion. We don't have a single sentence on their language. We don't know their culture. We know very little about them. We just suspect they were Aramaic speakers. They came from Syria, and they had a major political influence on the destiny of Babylonia. And that's why they became fused with one another. That's why Chaldean and Babylonian became synonymous. And the Aramaic language, of course, became a major language of culture in the Near East, starting with the Achaemenid period. And this explains why later, Aramaic became the main language of Eastern Christianity. So it became the literary language of Eastern Christianity. And of course, Aramaic was located, Syriac was mostly in northern Syria and northern Mesopotamia. But the Syriac is the second largest classical literature in a Semitic language after Arabic. So there are tons of Syriac manuscripts everywhere. So some Aramaic dialects are still spoken to this day. So of course, Aramaic was superseded by Arabic, largely. But you have communities and historical communities in Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, all Christians, of course, that retained, local varieties of Aramaic. But now it has disappeared with schooling in Arabic and immigration also. So these people have been scattered to various countries, and mostly in Europe and North America. And they try to maintain these languages, but it's very difficult.
It is.
And there are actually a number of them in Toronto. I know some of them personally.
Yeah,
Still
we're trying to do that too. I mean, like, we offer classes and everything, but yeah, it's not easy because our children, including mine, they're not, they're very westernized, and it's not an easy if you're not using it regularly or in schools and things. But we don't have that much time left, but so I really would like you to use our last couple of minutes to tell us what you're working on currently. And
I'm not working specifically on the Chaldeans now. My main project, I'm finishing a book on a private cuneiform archive from the city of Ur in southern Iraq, which dates. It has a short time span. It's a private archive, which dates to the beginning of the reign of Nabopolassar, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this archive is, it's people from Ur, but it's dated, the texts are written in Babylon. And they were probably there for military reasons, you see, for military conscription and military taxation also. So it's a very complicated archive, about 70 documents. And it shows, it dates to the period when Nabopolassar was rebelling, leading a rebellion against the Assyrians. And eventually that rebellion succeeded, and he succeeded in destroying the Assyrian Empire, so with the help of the Medes. So it's a very important archive because it gives us some inner, inside information on, how things worked, in Babylon during that troubled period. So, and it's not a period which is all that well documented, so it's quite important. But, I'm working, as you mentioned earlier, I'm working now mostly on the cuneiform archives from Ur and Uruk. So those from Ur are private archives, private families, and they were discovered in Ur during the excavations of the 1920s and 30s, led by Sir Leonard Woolley in collaboration with the Iraq Service of Antiquities and the University of Pennsylvania. But I'm also working on the temple archives of Uruk, the giant temple archive that has more than 8,000 documents, which dates mostly to the period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the early Achaemenid period. And I'm reconstructing currently, the rituals, the offerings, the sacrifices, their order and what they signify for the civic, culture of the city of Uruk. So that's my main project now, but I've zillions of smaller projects.
Yeah, I'm trying to catch up with them. So I started following you on academia. And yeah, I started following you, and then, but you have quite a bit of work, so it's going to take me maybe a lifetime to read everything. But right now, I am really enjoying this, A History of Babylon. Yeah, I'm really, really enjoying this, and it's very easy to purchase. I got it off from Amazon. I'm also looking forward to your new work, and we'll be happy to share it with people once it's out. So please let me know when that is out. I'd love to also read it. Um, you know, I, I'm just. This was such a fun conversation for me. It was very informative. I really appreciate all the work that you do. You bring so much knowledge to this, and I really appreciate it. I'm gonna just keep following you and watching out for your new work that is going to be published.
Well, thank you. It was a very pleasant experience to be here.
Thank you, thank you. And if you're ever in the area, please contact us, and we'll give you a tour of the Covering Museum.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.